This is a podcast where experts in movement and life tackle current concepts in health and wellness and use science and evidence as the foundation of how we discuss each topic. This is not medical advice, but a sedentary lifestyle is much more harmful, so we should move. The Motif Experience, where movement and life come together. I'm your host, Dr. Tyler Cuddeford. So if you have missed the last podcast, we talked about running shoes and shoe construction, manufacturing, materials, the development, those kinds of things. So if you haven't had a chance to look at that, not that this is gonna, I might reference a little bit of what we talked about, but this is really designed to think about and talk about injuries in runners, and is footwear related? So, yeah.
That's a huge question.
It is a huge question.
So is it related, footwear?
See that?
How much
so it's
does
complicated.
it matter?
It's complicated. So that's why, just like in the running world, running injuries are complicated. Trying to figure out as a recreational runner, trying to figure out via online or through Runner's World magazine or run of the mill person that may or may not be. Have the depth and breadth of knowledge in the running world in order to kind of help you. So this was kind of in part to try to dispel some of the, some of the things out there in running shoes and how, the running consumer may have some, which would be, some to think about. The running consumer, recreational and beyond, maybe not necessarily novice. They have opinions that are quite strong, especially the beyond recreational. They have quite strong opinions on the brand and the type and all of those things. And then there's enough anecdotal evidence to suggest that you put on a shoe that's you haven't ever run in before, or it's a different brand or a different style, and your feet hurt. So that's that's true. So I think a couple of definitions for me, and other people might define injury differently. In the literature, it's defined as not being able to run for a week, and so I think that's consistent in the literature. So we'll use that as our background definition. But I think what we also have to remember is injury is the failure of our body to adapt. As a biological system, we have lots of ways to make sure that we adapt. And there's a reason why, and this is really interesting. You have to remember this, and people do. Coaches will not put together a program that goes beyond this idea of increasing mileage or intensity more than about 10 to 30% a week. So if you think about it, as a recreational runner, if you're running 10 miles a week, you start to increase your mileage. It shouldn't be much more than a couple miles a week maximum. So, which means if you're running a couple days a week, it's a half mile to a mile difference in a run. So we have to. Well, I guess if you're running 10 miles a week and you're a novice runner, you're not probably running 5 miles. So if you think about it, it's less than a half a mile a week that you need to increase in order to kind of limit that excessive load or your inability to adapt. The literature's clear on that too. So there was a nice study. So for the listeners, watchers, JOSPT October 2014 has the whole entire journal is dedicated to running related injuries from the perspective of a runner, a coach, a physician. It's got really great research from Brian Heiderscheit, from Chris Powers, some other running experts, and it has a segment on barefoot running. So it's really profound. I mean, it's really great read if you really want to kind of get into the details of running analysis, running injuries, footwear. It's not a lot on the footwear piece, but, and that's It's got a little bit, but doesn't necessarily link footwear to injury.
This is great, yeah. Talking about how to safely increase your mileage.
Yes.
This is great.
Yeah, it's a great overview of most things about running. So how to change someone's form, how to shorten someone's stride, how to kind of eliminate some of these. It breaks it down really nicely. There's Brian Heiderscheid's work. If you don't have the sophistication in your clinic or in the lab, that you have 3D cameras or instrumented treadmills to be able to kind of look at the load, you can use just a 2D camera from the side, and you can. That is a good surrogate for load. Several measurements. So overstriding. Excessive tibial inclination angle. So there's a couple of key things you can look at in the video, and it links nicely. It's related to excessive force. So you read those papers, because that will help you if you're doing some 2D analysis and don't have access to force plates and instrumented treadmills or foot pressure or those kinds of things. That will help you really take a nice objective look at people.
I'll link that one in the show notes too.
Yeah, that'd be great.
So if you're saying that that an injury is the failure of the body to adapt, what does shoes have to do with that?
So let's create a little frame. So load is failure of our body to adapt. So if I were to look at vertical ground reaction force, and the peaks of that, not necessarily the rates of loading, those things which are really minute. Those are the details that I think people look at that probably are inconsequential. So I'll just say that. But the maximum load is probably not. So it's irrespective of running form and irrespective of footwear, as an example. Now the form looks different. So the waveform for a vertical ground reaction force, there's kind of this sharp rise, right? It's got a little bump and then a little higher rise. So it's kind of this. If you've not looked at it, you can go online and just type in ground reaction force and running, and you can see this nice little picture of what it looks like. And that's typically a typical picture. If you were to run on your forefoot versus your heel, that first little peak is gone. So they call it that heel strike transient. So essentially that's gone during a forefoot strike. And then also, so that's our forefoot versus heel. Barefoot. So if you were to run on your forefoot and you looked at that peak, that would be gone. Or footwear, that would be gone. So irrespective of footwear, barefoot or with in shoes, the form remains the same whether you're running on your forefoot in shoes or no shoes. Similarly, if you have shoes and no shoes, but you run your heel, the same. The form looks different between barefoot and shod, but the form is exactly the same whether you run barefoot on your heel or barefoot in shoes. But if you look at the magnitudes of that force, and that's the important piece, people kind of get a little sideways on the importance of, and we need to do a podcast on running injuries, mechanisms, things like that. This is really supposed to be about footwear. But people wig out a little bit on these other planes, transverse planes, coronal plane, things like that, where the load is very minimal. So it's 1/10 the load of a vertical ground reaction force. 1/10. So if you think about 1,000 newtons, it's 100 newtons. In the other planes, it's much more than 1,000. Yeah. It's closer to 5,000. So a recreational runner. So you can think about that. It's these other planes. I think there's some link. As far as mechanically, but the predominant load is in the sagittal plane. So if you look at the peak loads, they're nearly within a few percent the same as whether it's barefoot or shod, forefoot or heel. The peak load is nearly the same. So that's something to remember. other piece of that is it's also irrespective of surface type.
Okay.
So you could run on a track, nice, the current the rubber track, and you can run on asphalt, or you can run on concrete, you can run on dirt, and you can run on trails, or you can run on grass. The load that your body is experiencing, that vertical ground reaction force, is exactly the same. It's within a few percent of each other.
So those that say, sorry, I don't mean to cut you
yeah,
off there.
No,
so
go.
Those that say, like, I always get injured when I run on the road. Or, like, if I run on trails or the track, I feel much better. It's much softer, more forgiving on the joints.
Yeah.
Is that BS?
Well, not necessarily BS. Your body finds a way to accommodate the load. Mm-hmm. So if you looked at acceleration, so if you put an accelerometer that measures a G-force, it's probably it's within 10%. So if you think about it, that's really pretty small variation between the surfaces, whether you're running on grass or concrete. Your body wants to attenuate that shock, and so it figures out how to do that. Now, I think we would go all the way back to, well, here's another piece. It's also irrespective of pace. So you can run twice as fast. It's not irrespective. So make this clear. When you run twice as fast from a 10-minute pace per mile to a 5-minute mile, it's twice as fast. The increase in load is only 17%. So it's minimal. So so again, the vertical ground reaction force changes very little compared to the pace. That's a significant alteration in pace. Yeah, from a 5-minute mile to a 10-minute mile.
Very fast.
It's very fast. Yeah. And so, and with that, the loads, and I think you can even go with, I think it might even be maybe a 4:30 pace or something that, and a 12-minute pace. If you compare those two, are 11:30s to 4:30s, it's about only a 17% increase.
Now, could some people argue? Because some people argue lots of different things, especially in the runner's world. Depending on the person, could that 17% be significant? I'm
going to say yeah. Okay. So again, if we use the definition, and I think the track example that you said before, it's softer, it seems like it's better on my body.
Yeah.
There are differences between the loads. 10%, 17%. So yeah, there are differences. I think the magic number for what we talked about before, for a coach to put people on, I don't know why 10% pops up. It might be really, that might be really important. And so if your body has not adapted, so the failure of the body to adapt to the load, then you're going to get injured. So I do believe that is the case. So if someone has these symptoms, history of running on the road months at a time, and then developing injury versus, well, it didn't happen when I ran on the track or on the on the grass, then I'm going to believe that, and I'm going to try to get them to be stronger, and for that body to accommodate the load.
So if they were then, so if what you're saying is, depending on the person, you obviously want to tailor their running in increments every week so that they don't get that failure to adapt.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter if they wear shoes or they're barefoot.
No.
If they don't increase properly and their body doesn't adapt to the load, whether they have shoes or not, they're probably going to get some of those symptoms.
Yeah, and I think we could use that with footwear too. So there's enough evidence to say that this is weird for people. When I change brands, I get injured. And I think if we looked at that closer, we could probably figure it out. But there's no studies that have looked at that. But my guess is it's having to do with our body's inability to adapt. I was a guinea pig. I had a size 9, and so I was the sample size for Nike. And so any footwear that was developed, I was a guinea pig for that. And I do remember, footwear was like I don't know, at that time I was probably around 35 miles a week. It wasn't a ton. But there were times when it's just like, this bothers me to run. And whether it would be your Achilles, whatever it was, I did feel like it was, it bothered me during that, section of time when you ran it. So, but I have to believe that through accommodation, if you were just to kind of keep... Now, in that particular case, you're going from 0 miles a week to 35. Because it's a totally different footwear. Right. So you have to think about if you were to modulate that and only go up, 10% a year, 10% a week. I would. I'm pretty sure that you would minimize all those injuries.
I'm interested because what you were saying kind of sparked something in me. These Zoom flies are these really pretty. I'm showing it on the cameras. Marathon runners were just running crazy in these. Oh, I've got to try these. Me, I'm a novice runner. I'm a much more of a power athlete. I have better, horsepower than I have distance. But I started running in these and noticed that my Achilles tendon started getting a lot more sore after running. Really angry. And I know the angle was different than the Pegasus shoe that I was wearing. But whether it was all in my head or not, I'm not sure. So explain that to me. So if I'm changing, what is this? The drop? Like what are you talking about?
The drop is the difference between the height of the heel and the height of the forefoot.
People know what drop works best for them.
That's true.
Explain that to me. Like how people have different preferences. And can notice, like you were saying, if a little something kind of was annoying me. And in my case, it was my Achilles because I felt like I was more of a forefoot striker. Or the shoe was a sensory, but just explain it to me.
That's a great question. This shoe lends itself to forefoot strikers. The way that it's kind of designed, the drop, the load of the carbon fiber plate on the forefoot, the way that there's really no heel. There's hardly any heel counter, but also the way that your foot strikes, in a standard shoe. It's pretty wide in the heel, right? So that's because that's where you land. And in this particular one, most people land on, if they're a heel striker, land on the outside, so you can see. Many shoes accommodate that. This is a little bit, lighter foam, it's less stiff on that side. So when you land, it cushions a little bit, a little more firmer on the inside. This is not that way. So I'll show the viewers here, and we talked about this so this little review. That forefoot width is strikingly different than the heel width. And so it really accommodates that forefoot runner. It was built for the forefoot runner,
felt very fast wearing it until
I.e. Iliad. So if you think about if you're forefoot striking, where's the highest load?
In your forefoot.
Well, on forefoot, but it's stressing the Achilles tendon.
Yes,
So you're making that angry automatically because you are now the Achilles tendon is now being the stiffness of that has to be higher because you're landing on it. And so as opposed to a heel striker. So I've often put those that are forefoot strikers that are angry in the Achilles tendon on a heel strike program. To offload the tendon enough for it to kind of get less angry, so then we can do some heavy loading on the Achilles to make it better.
So irrespective of the footwear, it was where my body wanted to land. So it was basically that in my training, I was putting a lot more load through the Achilles by putting more emphasis on the forefoot strike. Rather than the shoe actually doing it, it was more my perception of how I should run while wearing the shoe. Okay.
So a couple of things. If you ask someone to kind of shorten their stride a little bit, they'll automatically position their heels. Well, overstriders, classic would be you're stretching that foot way out too far in front of you, and you've got if you were to draw a vertical ground reaction force, the moment created at the knee is substantial. And so what happens is you've got the quads, the patella tendon, has to absorb that load. So if you put your heel and foot a little more underneath you, then you have less load at the knee. And what it does, it forces you, if you will, not to land so, or to not accentuate the landing of the heel, but since you bring it underneath your body a little bit more, it's really hard to land on your heel.
Yeah.
And so it forces you, if you will, to kind of be a less heel striker and more move that the way where you land more on your forefoot.
Okay.
And so and then the footwear too kind of lends itself to kind of puts you in this position to land more on your forefoot.
Yeah.
So
really interesting because it makes me think about overpronation.
Oh.
And you were discussing before we started a new paper that came out. And it's not just that paper, but a lot of people will blame overpronation for injury.
Yeah.
And I've seen some people with horrible running form.
Yeah.
Overpronate, they do weird things. They're not like marathon trained, they're not runners. They're out at the 5K just giving it their best. No pain.
Right.
They're doing fine. And they look like, oh my gosh.
I got to fix that.
Yeah, but tell me more about that.
One of the things, the most valuable part of understanding running for me as a physical therapist, a biomechanist, someone that's interested in running, it was at Nike. So I actually did running analysis before my PhD at Iowa. So would film people on the treadmill. Had a nice camera, and so I did a lot of that here locally. And when I was at Iowa, my PhD actually was on patellofemoral pain and running, and so my interest was running back then. So did a very should have published it. It was kind of the same time. Some others were being published, not in, how do I say this without like...
Throw them under the bus.
I'm not throwing under the bus. Some of the theories that we developed at Iowa were several years ahead of others that are doing running injuries.
I see.
So I thought it was... patellofemoral pain wasn't necessarily related to the patella hitting the back of your, trail catcher, right? Yeah. So, or the back of your, femur. So, I thought that was a different mechanism, and so we found that was to be true, and subsequently people came out with this proximal control idea. So Christopher Powers, wonderful person, good researcher.
We'll have to get him on.
Yeah, you'll have to get him on. That was it. I mean, it was about proximal control was helped alleviate some of the challenges that recreational runners had, especially those with patellofemoral pain.
And proximal control in the way of glute strength,
hip strength. Mostly glute strength. Yeah, glute and quad strength to be able to better control the position of your tibia relative to your femur.
Wow.
So let's go back. Where were we at? Where you said overpronation and injury. Yeah. So a recent paper suggested that these injuries are related to pronation. They had the same footwear. It was a kind of a controlled study. It was randomized. It had I think 380 people in it, maybe something like that. So it was
good sample size.
It was a good sample size. Maybe more, maybe 700, 300 in each group. I don't know how many it was. That's my bad, but so it's interesting because they had hard shoes versus soft shoes, and you could measure. It's called Shore, Shore, the Shore value of the cushion. So you can measure that, and they did. There was a comparison between a soft shoe and then a more stability shoe, which would be a little more firm. So they had two groups, one with soft shoes, one with not soft shoes, a little harder. The initial run statistics was that the softer shoes showed less injuries. The softer shoe showed less injuries than the harder shoe. and BMI was not a contributing factor. But they went and divided by BMI anyway, so meaning they stratified a high BMI group, and it's just random. They picked a number, and then a low BMI group, and then ran the stats again and found that the harder shoes had less injuries than the softer shoes. So just methodology, that to me is like, well, you falsified stratification by picking runners that had a high BMI versus low when there was no difference statistically between those groups in the first place. Right. So, I think there's some pause there for me to think about that. And it's not just that one study. So we have to compare that with other like studies. So the one, there was nearly 1,000 runners. They actually looked at both feet. So there was, nearly 2,000 feet. It was 1,800 and something. 1,900 feet. It was a 1-year prospective study, so they picked runners that wanted to do an event a year from now, and so they gave them footwear. And it was irrespective, so I have to remember some of the details I miss, only because I probably shouldn't. I think they all had the same shoe. Yeah, so I'm pretty sure that was the case.
Do you know which study this is?
Yeah, this is the Nielsen 2013 paper. I think that's going to be less trivial. So they did look at pronation though. So they I think everyone had the same shoe. It was a neutral shoe, irrespective of foot type. So you could so they separated between pronated, highly pronated, neutral, and supinated feet. But everyone had the same footwear. They tracked mileage, so that was another thing too, where everyone got a GPS, and everyone got free shoes, and it was really great. And they followed them for a year, and then it culminated into a run, and then they looked at running injuries related to their year-long training program. And their result was there was no difference between any types of pronation and injury. Zero. Wow. I thought that was a better study, control study, and a military study. So there's a military study, NAPIC, and I think 2000. I don't remember the number. 2014. Pick a number. It's also in the October.
The issue of the
JSPT. It had over 7,200 runners. So it was all 3 branches of the military had different types of footwear, classified your arch height, which can be related to pronation, classified the 3 different low, high arch, flat foot, and then a normal foot. And again, there was different footwear. No difference. So irrespective of footwear, foot type, and footwear, the injuries were the same. So there's other studies that disagree with these, a couple of more recent ones, and so one of the things in the most recent study, they automatically classified pronation. They defined what a pronation running injury was, but we just talked about 2 or 3 studies that showed there was no difference in if you had pronation and any injury.
Right.
But what they did, they classified, these pronation-like injuries, so anterior knee pain, patellofemoral pain, foot pain, all of those people were put into the pronation-related injury. So then they looked at people's pronation. Well, in of itself, those aren't pronation-related injuries.
Right.
So you can't do that. Because someone has patellofemoral pain, we actually know that's related to proximal control at the hip. I mean, that's clear in the literature for Chris Powers, I don't know, pick a number, 20 years, doing research on that. And so we know that it's really related to proximal control of the hip. It's not related to pronation at the foot. And so to just automatically assume that those are pronation-related injuries and then stratify or, categorize people into those groups and then run your statistics, it's flawed to start with because we know without question that those are not pronated-related injuries.
Mm-hmm. So this might be another podcast itself. But when we talk about power of studies, there are a lot of people that cherry pick. There are a lot of people that maybe they didn't have a great EBP class when they're or evidence-based practice class when they were in school. I think that's fair. What qualifies as like a really good study? And you can talk about anecdotal. It doesn't need to be like you don't need to go through like the 5 layers of evidence.
Right.
When people are looking for studies and they say, well, this one says this, and they basically try to find a confirmation bias. They pick what article supports their claim and say, well, this one works.
Yeah.
Why? What's the best, or why?
That's such a great question. You're right. That's another podcast because that it has to be. I think you're right on that. We could probably
even bring Hauck in because he's research guru.
I think we'd bring Hauck in.
That'd be great.
And then while he's here, I think we bring maybe next week we should do that one. Yeah, because I
really feel like there's a huge lapse in what people quantify as, I found this or I did my own research on PubMed and I found this article.
Right.
And they basically say this is the paper.
Right.
Hardly ever, I feel like, is there just one paper that gives you the answer for one thing.
That's such that and I feel bad for clinicians.
I'm going to close this room.
Yeah.
You keep talking.
I feel bad for clinicians because it's really hard for them to keep up on the current literature. So you're right. It's easy for them to pop up an article and say, look what my boss sent me or so-and-so sent me. Oh my gosh, it's a great article. Mm-hmm. But they haven't done the work in finding the depth and breadth in that area.
Right.
As an example, the Achilles tendinopathy clinical practice guideline. We read 1,000 articles in the last 10 years. So just in an injury, that's not that common. 5 to 10% of runners. So it's on the low side. You clinicians rarely see it unless you're, specialize in, tendon challenges. You might have one a year, maybe even less. And so when something pops up, you have to compare it to the rest of the literature. You can't just, assume that this is true. I think a great example, and we should have Brahman in. Here's another podcast.
Yeah.
Write it down. BFR. And so that's up and coming. He's probably published independently more. He's got more people in his studies than all the BFR studies combined. Nearly. I think that I was exaggerating, but he's one that has a ton of data on blood flow restriction. And it's interesting, it doesn't agree with all these previous studies. So now, if we're going to grade the breadth and depth of articles around BFR, we have to take into account his. Because some of the early studies had 5 people in the study, 7 people in the study, and they show these massive differences. Well, he's got, 20 people in each group and not showing any difference. So we have to look at both of those together, not just one article that pops up and says, oh my gosh. I think another good example would be, and these are maybe on our Mythbusters ones, this SFMA stuff, right? So functional movement screen, specific kinds of stuff, whether it be wideband, all that stuff, symmetry related. The first papers that popped up showed a relationship, between somebody that was asymmetrical and injury. But there's at least a dozen, if not more, since that have showed no difference.
Right.
So if you're comparing all of the data as a clinical practice guideline, that would get a D as a grade. Same with the one the one that we just mentioned. If the BFR right now would get a D, even though the first couple of years of studies were positive, the more that come out that show that there's no difference, larger sample sizes, better controlled. That to me is important. And you don't have to, as a clinician, you don't have time to do all that. And that was one of the reasons why we kind of wanted to do this.
Yeah.
To start is to help our alumni and those that are, full of clinical practice. And maybe they didn't like research. That's fine. It's not for everybody. But unless you're in it, you're going to have a hard time understanding that one article that pops up.
Right.
Yeah.
And that is also probably why we have so many different ways of treating things, and why will there be a CPG on footwear? Or is there one? And I'm like,
I'm pretty sure there's not.
Yeah.
There would be a handful of people in the world that would be experts in that. And I don't know very many.
Okay.
Right. So there were a handful at Nike that would be, but they didn't do studies on it. So there's lots of internal studies on Nike that would be proprietary, that would be we wouldn't ever have access to. So there's a ton of data there. Same with other footwear companies. Have their own internal data that's not published, but used it for marketing or and research.
And ask if it'd be advantageous for them to let out their studies that say the shoe doesn't matter, because they want the shoe to matter and they sell it. Well,
here's the deal, though. You can pick up differences in these shoes. So you can pick up subtle differences in the engineering on how well it gets cushioned. You can pick up these subtle differences in the way that the heel counter works and doesn't work. You can pick up differences in cushioning and traction, because those are all biomechanical measures that we can do with instrumentation. But what we talked about earlier, most of those things are trivial when the body is trying to adapt. So it becomes trivial. Yes, there's these subtle differences in the way that the shoe performs. You can pick those up. It's real. But I'm of the understanding that the body doesn't care. The body doesn't regulate that. The body regulates something else. Probably center of mass is most important. Load, shock attenuation is important. So the body actually measures those things. So
see, that's actually a great point, because what PTs want to know now, or the layperson who might not be a PT, maybe the biomechanist wants to know, what would you tell runners is the primary thing to do if footwear and non-footwear doesn't, if it doesn't matter? What are your recommendations?
So I like to think of runners in three categories: kind of the novice, the recreational, and the elite. And so the training program should be unique to each of those categories. As an example, in the novice in the novice group, nearly all the injuries are at the knee. So up to 80% of people get injured. Greater than 50% of the injuries happen at the knee. So my program as a PT, I'm going to try to eliminate knee problems. The second would be Achilles or shin splints, as it kind of ranks up there too. So my program is going to deal with our body's ability to adapt to those additional stresses, because you've started a running program, and it's going to be on the knee and the way that you land. That's just straight up. And so this is not published. We should write it up. We did a study that looked at a pre-running injury program. We call it a PrEP program. And so we had novice runners who had not done a 10K before and have not been consistent in running. And we had 20 people in the group, and we put them on a pre-running exercise program. So a 8-week training program before they even started to run. And then we put them on a running program, just a slow, increase your mileage, so you could culminate in another 2-3 months. I don't remember what it was. I think 10 weeks, another 10-week program to accommodate the 5K. So I think I might have said 10K, but it culminated in a 5K run. And so for all of these people, they've never done a 5K run. So we had training sessions and training programs, and it started off with just loading, as if it. You pretended that they're going to have a anterior knee pain, patellofemoral pain. That's number one. So we put them on a program. I'm mentioning Chris a lot, but we put him on his program. And it was just like before they even just started to running. Because if we believe that injury is a failure of our body to adapt, then that's going to work. And our injury rate was 10% compared to... So we had... it was actually 5%. One person, you have to count it. It wasn't a running-related injury, but it happened. They ended up having not to run for a week, right? So it counted. Ended up having surgery, not related to running, but you have to count that. Right. So we had 10%. We had 2 people of the 20 get injured. One was probably related to running, and the other one we know that wasn't related to running. Yeah. Right. But if you compare that to all of the other running injury, epidemiology studies on running injuries, like I said, it goes from 50 to 80% of runners get injured. So ours was amazingly low. So we think there is something about that.
Yeah, I like that. I think that answered the question pretty well. So footwear, anything else you want to mention about footwear being important at all in a running program? So we know it doesn't matter. Is your philosophy then just the training alone will probably mitigate most of those injuries? So they can pick any shoe that they're comfortable in. Yeah, so
I'm a big fan of being comfortable. Yeah, so that point of purchase kind of shoe, that's important. Big fan of people that do that. Not a big fan of companies that sell a bunch of footwear and they have someone that's 20 years old, high school graduate, telling them all about their running injuries, and this shoe is going to help with this. They're not qualified really.
But, you're talking about like the retail stores, and
the retail stores.
Try that on the treadmill right here,
and then So they're really not qualified to do that, because I'm hoping, as you understand, as people are listening or watching, it's complicated, and we have to know all of the kind of confounding variables of that person if you're gonna mention something. So if people want to try different footwear, it would be something like this. You wear them around the house, then you wear them to work, and then you wear them along. Then you run you run a few miles in them, and then go back to your other footwear. So your body has to accommodate to the differences kind of in that load. And here's some other confounding stuff too. I mean, this is why it's complicated. Couple studies out there. Some people at Penn State, so they ended up being at Nike, so I knew them. Gordon Valiant, Mario LaFortune, great biomechanists, top of the pile when it comes to footwear biomechanics. Of course, came from Penn State's biomechanics lab, PhDs in that. They did a study where they looked at the influence of excessive pronated footwear. So they took some shoes and they cut the medial side of the shoe and the lateral side of the shoe and had a neutral shoe. So if you think about you're cutting the medial side, you are pronating your shoe. I mean, your foot gets whacked out. It's you can see the calcaneus move in. Conversely, if you cut a 15-degree wedge out of the lateral side of the shoe, when you stand, you're supinated. So your foot is in supinated position. Your heel is clearly not in alignment, and so you could say that at least in the rear foot that's pronated and supinated, everted and and inverted, and so and then they looked at the influence that had on the knee. So here you go, ready? And the way they did that was with bone pins. So they stuck a bone pin in, I think they had one in the foot. Maybe not. No, clearly in the tibia and in the femur. And then they had, reflective markers. So then they're looking at the behavior of the influence that aggressive orthotic or footwear position, midsole. We talked about the midsole and outsole. No influence of the knee. You're standing there, and your foot is whacked out, everted or inverted, and there's no difference at the knee. How can I did the same study 20-some years later?
Were you able to do that in the U.S.?
We did.
Drilled bone pins in people?
No. So I don't know if we've talked about this yet. Maybe I can bring that in the BS session before before the EVP session. No, we did a bone pin study of our own where we looked at the influence that different footwear, different orthotics, different conditions of running versus skiing. I mean, we just put the bone pins in, measured everything we could, and then took them out. There's 3 of us in the study, and then again, there was no change at the knee. That
was wild.
It was wild.
Surprising.
So your body figures out a way to adapt, and so I think that's important to think about. So when you're changing footwear or wanting to try something, your body has to adapt in order to figure that out, and it does. Okay. So
I think this is already amazingly rich with information. What else do you feel like is important? What do people need to know? Or do you feel like you adequately covered it? Because there is...
Yeah, I am not anti-Nike at all. I appreciated my time there a ton. They are serious about looking at shoes and biomechanics, and one of the I think I started off by saying this earlier. I don't think I finished the thought. We saw thousands of runners that weren't injured, but they all had wonky gait, right? So I think sometimes that person comes into your clinic and they have knee pain, and you watch them run and their foot's all wonky. We assume that that's because their knee hurts because their foot's all wonky, but it's not true, right? So we know with these studies that pronation doesn't matter. We know that people can run wonky and never get injured. And so we made this assumption that it's because they look a little bad biomechanically, and now we've got to fix that in order to make their injury go away. But I think we've forgotten that it's really related to our body's inability to adapt.
Yeah.
And that's the important piece.
That's fascinating. Load them up, get them trained up.
Yeah.
And see what happens.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
It's all brilliant. We'll link the studies in the show notes. We'll take questions as they come up. We can answer some in Mythbusters. But I really feel like that was a great overview of how footwear really has... It's not the whole piece of the pie.
It's not the whole piece of the pie. And I think that if we're going to do a take-home, does it influence it? Probably. But it's not about that. It's about our body's ability to adapt to the load. And so that's what I think people should be, more concerned about rather than the type of footwear.
Right. So train them up 10% more each week, you
said? 10 to 30. You can go up to 30. It's in the JOSPT group. So, or in that, group of articles. You can see that. And it's really complicated. So you're not alone, when you're trying to figure these runners out, because there's a lot of things that kind of influence that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I appreciate that, and I know our PTs and people out there appreciate it. Whether maybe they're in footwear, maybe they work at a running company. Yeah. But I think that's all really helpful.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay.
That's fun.
That was good.
Wow, great topic today, great conversation today. Thanks for listening. Thanks for tuning in. And just make sure you're connecting with us in some way, whether it would be, liking or subscribing, You can connect with us directly, and be sure to visit our website, motifcenter.com. And if you want to be featured in our Q&A, send us a question. We'll be happy to answer that in our Q&A session, and let us know where you're coming from.